Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Chief Learning Officer webinar. My name is Alec, and I'm here today, as usual, to help answer any of your technical or general questions that you may have. But before we get started, I'm going to cover a couple things that you need to know about the session today. There is no dial-in number for attendees, so all audio will be streaming to you through your computer speakers or headphones. So if you're hearing me now, we are good to go. So please adjust your volume there accordingly as well. You can submit questions for today's speakers or any technical issues that you may encounter by clicking on that Q&A icon located on the right-hand side of your screen. You can see an example of that button labeled here on this slide with the top arrow. Click that Q&A icon, type in your question, and click Submit. If it's a technical question, I'll have an answer for you that will appear in that same box after you submit. I should have an answer for you within a couple minutes. If it is a content-related question, it may be pulled during the Q&A session during today's webinar if time allows. You can download a PDF of the slide deck by clicking on the handouts icon located on the right-hand side of your screen as well, labeled here on this slide with the bottom arrow. Click there and you should be able to pull down that PDF. Today's webinar is being recorded. You're going to receive a link to that recording in a follow-up email along with your HRCI and SHRM certification codes for today's event. So keep an eye open for that. That will come from HCM Events. All right, so in today's webinar titled Goodbye Traditional Performance Reviews, Hello Real-Time Performance Feedback, we have a couple of great speakers and great guests with us today. First, we have Joe Wilmore. Joe is a performance consultant for the Training Associates. He is highly regarded by industry peers and is a leader in the field of human performance. With over 2 decades of experience as a consultant, facilitator, and trainer, he has worked with a wide range of public and private sector organizations within the United States as well as internationally. Joining Joe, we have Jasmine Martirosyan. Jasmine is the Vice President of Marketing at the Training Associates. Jasmine is passionate about creating an engaged organizational culture and leading with effective performance practices. Jasmine is also has a PhD in law and policy and is an expert in social psychology and organizational behavior. So with those introductions out of the way, we're going to get things started, and I'm going to pass things over to you, Jasmine.
Hi, thank you so much, Alec, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're delighted to be leading today's webinar and sharing our expertise with the attendees. We have a very impressive 981 attendees, which is phenomenal. So thank you for taking the time to join. A little bit about TTA. TTA is an organization that leads in everything related to learning and development. We specialize in customized solutions for organizations of all sizes, including many Fortune 500 organizations, and we have a huge network of consultants that share their expertise, over 25,000 of them. So now we're going to conduct a very brief poll for all of you folks, and then once the poll is in place with the results, we'll dive into sharing of our content. So please chime in. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. We're going to give you 40 seconds to respond to the poll. It's always very interesting to get the temperature. Now we have the poll.
Okay, great. This is Joe. And also, let me join Jasmine in welcoming you to the session. And thanks for you taking the time, because we know you're all busy. And if you're giving up your lunch in order for this webinar, or more likely, you are having lunch, listening to the webinar, answering email, and preparing for the meeting that comes up after the webinar. And so you're multitasking. So we want to make this as productive and as useful for you as possible. Well, I'll tell you what, when you look at the poll results here, obviously I'm not that surprised. The reality is that the vast majority of people do have a tendency to think that whatever they're doing for performance appraisal and performance management, it can be better, it can be improved over what it is. And let's see, I need to move to the next slide here. So if we could do that. Yeah. Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about performance management, performance appraisal. Those poll results are not that unique. The reality is, regardless of what industry you talk to or who you consult with, whether it's public or private sector, whether we're talking executive or middle management or employees, the reality is most organizations tend to feel that there are a lot of things they're not happy about with their performance management system. So for instance, the first bullet down there says time consuming. Deloitte, for instance, is one organization that looked at this, and when they measured how much billable hours they were using on their annual appraisal system, they were shocked. That was money out of their pockets. That was billable time they were losing. And that's also very resource intensive. For those of you who happen to be in the HR human capital field who are listening to this, you know how your life gets taken over about 3 weeks before your annual performance appraisal. And generally the day before, 2 days before, a week before, you're sending out reminders or emails to, geez, probably 30 or 40% of your managers saying, hey, Jeff, Janet, just a reminder, I haven't seen your performance results yet. You need to get them in for your team. The popularity bullet, let's be realistic here. Almost no one looks forward to performance appraisals, and most folks find them to be pretty painful. Not quite as bad as a root canal without anesthesia, but pretty close to that. Subjective, again, most folks, even when they do the best job they can, tend to feel that most performance appraisals are not objective, they're very subjective, and related to the ineffective piece, they're generally regarded as not doing a really good job at identifying the best talent, rewarding the best talent, and keeping the best talent. The last bullet about lacks a growth mindset, I want to talk a little bit more about this. There's a lot of research from a range of different sources that shows that the best performers and the people who improve the most are individuals who have a growth mindset. And it goes by a range of different titles or names based upon when you're looking at the research or what field you're looking at the research. But a growth mindset is really a mindset that says, I can do better. This is not my best. Instead, I have room to grow. I have room to improve. Or even if this is my best now, it's not going to be my best in 6 months or my best in a year. Part of the challenge is that right now, our performance appraisal systems really penalize you for having a growth mindset. An example that I want to use, and I have to borrow this with credit from David Rock, who is the head of the Neuro Leadership Institute. And he's talked extensively about this, and he's done a lot of research about performance management. Specifically, what he says is that it's the distinction between going into a performance appraisal feeling like you need to prove yourself. In other words, you need to justify to whoever you're talking to, I'm good, I'm a good performer, I deserve that bonus, versus improve yourself. And the improve yourself means going in saying, here's some skills I want to get better at. Here's some areas I think are weaknesses. Here's some areas that, frankly, I struggle at. The reality is, for the vast majority of performance appraisals that we go into, we're discouraged, we're penalized for going in with an improve or a growth mindset. Instead, we're encouraged, we're rewarded for going in with a prove mindset. That's how we get the bonus. That's how we get the best performance scores, by going into our manager and making the case for why we were the top person on the team or why we had an outstanding year. And now, Jasmine.
So you're raising a very good point, and this actually has deep roots in how the corporate culture in our country, in actually all of North America, has looked at performance, providing performance reviews and performance feedback. GE at one time was heralded for having those stack reviews, but in essence, it stopped innovation and drove people to try to penalize certain people to have the lineup for those that would be cut out of the organization. In the process, innovation was stifled. Now, the poll results that our attendees shared are absolutely stunning. It's staggering. It's very hard to think of any other area of organizational development that would get a 98% response saying, oh, this needs change. That's huge, which means we're talking about a phenomenon that's very pervasive, that affects everybody. It affects not just the organizations, it affects the people within the organizations, their well-being, their creativity, the outcomes. Fundamentally, it really cripples the system. And there is a huge cost to this that we do not see. For instance, the Globe and Mail did a very detailed study, and on average, an organization spends about 5 hours per employee. Now, if you're a 5,000 employee organization, which is not too huge in the grand scheme of things, it would mean 25,000 hours of work. And if you calculate it on average at a $60 per hour with benefits and everything, so that would cost $1.5 million annually to that organization. Now, if any manager, director, VP wanted to allocate $1.5 million and spend something, they would have to prove the ROI and get an approval. And here's a system that's not working, that you would never get the approval for, yet it persists. So what can be done to change that? And in effect, what's important is the quality of the traditional performance reviews is dropping further, because in the past 10 years, the number of people that managers manage has gone from 4 10 years ago on average to 7. So managers' time is even more taxed. And a Deloitte study also separately showed that the average manager, person who manages people, spends 10 years in their position before they're even offered any management training on how to even conduct performance reviews. Again, this is a very stunning thing for us to think about, because this is not something that managing people, by the way, is not even taught in most schools, and even a lot of business programs do not provide that detail that's needed. Just like medical schools do not teach bedside care and communication skills. So those are huge phenomenon that have an impact on us, and so getting a line on getting rid of the old-fashioned performance reviews and going with the new one is critical to our corporate landscape. So setting SMART goals is absolutely critical when we're talking about performance reviews. And frankly, talking about performance reviews without first looking at what the goals are like is absolutely meaningless, because there is absolutely no context. Unfortunately, it happens more often than we'd like to think about it, because performance reviews in the traditional format are kind of managed by HR. There is a kerfuffle every few weeks within a certain time of the year where people get involved. It has to be done. Nobody's really excited about it, and so they proceed, but they keep on surviving. Whereas the bigger thing is to look and see, what are we measuring performance on, and did we even have goals around this? Now, a lot of people may say they have goals, but not all goals are created equal. The goals have to be SMART goals. I'm pretty confident that most people on this webinar have heard of SMART goals. Just a quick refresher: SMART goals need to be specific, measurable, achievable, results-focused, and time-bound. And let's talk about specific examples. So specificity, it has to spell out what it is that we're trying to measure, right? And or what it is that we're trying to accomplish and achieve. So for you to reflect, most people have resumes, otherwise they would not be in positions, though even that landscape is changing. So when you look at resumes, whether you're hiring or when your friends or colleagues ask you to review their resumes, the lack of SMART goals really easily comes across, because then they're talking a lot of the time about responsibilities and not about what they have accomplished. And that's rooted in the fact that no SMART goals were set in the first place. Because once you have measurable accomplishments, then those would be set and reflected on a person's resume. So this is a deeper cultural organizational issue that we're observing with this. Hence, a lot of the performance reviews that end up occurring later in the year are meaningless, and they're not grounded in a reality that's supported or that can help people grow, innovate, improve, and drive real, changes. For instance, when Joe was talking about the growth mindset, in the traditional performance review landscape, the growth mindset is lacking. So if we do not have a shared understanding of success factors and goals from the outset, how can we effectively appraise the performance of the person, of the employee? So you can see how this leads to unhealthy dynamics within an organization. Joe?
Yeah, I don't have anything to say further about SMART goals, but let's talk a little bit about the criteria for what a good performance management process would look like. And that way, we can use that to judge any particular method or approach that we want to take. Because after this, we're going to get into, so here's some ideas for what you ought to be doing. The first piece, and this sounds self-evident, but it's real tough to achieve, is that if your performance management system does not encourage or feed or reward a growth mindset, and you've got to be brutally honest about this, if it doesn't reward a growth mindset, then your performance management system is holding your performance down. It's encouraging people to show up for annual reviews, justifying why they're a great employee, rather than saying, how do we get better? What do I need to do next? How do I improve? Here are some areas that I think are weak spots for me. How can I work on those? Okay, so the first thing is you got to measure, are we encouraging a growth mindset? And you can oftentimes assess this just by going to managers who've done performance review, and they'll say, oh, yeah, my people are being positive. And you can say, what areas did they list as being weaknesses and stuff they need to improve in? And in almost all cases, it's very minimal stuff, or it's stuff that's not directly related to the job. It's tangential or something that's not a critical skill. The second thing is you want to make sure that you get an accurate performance assessment. And that means as much as possible, you want to try and make it objective. And we'll talk about that. This is something that's a bugaboo. It's a problem for most performance appraisals because we're oftentimes measuring the wrong stuff. The third thing is timeliness. Sounds fine in concept. Let's talk about what that means in reality. Timeliness, a wide body of research demonstrates that almost always feedback and information and corrective action is more likely to have an impact if it happens closely to the performance. So when we have an annual review that happens once a year, odds are that managers may be bringing up stuff where the performer is going, huh? What? I don't recall that. What are you talking about? Now, in theory, the answer to that would be for managers to have continual conversations with employees. And all of you can probably think of a couple of examples where you can point to a manager or leader going, you know what, there's an ongoing conversation. I always know where I stand with that manager. They're always giving me info about what they liked, what I need to change. But there are plenty of managers who don't. They view that as that's a conversation that happens at the end of the year. And for those of you in HR, think of all the complaints you get around performance appraisals, where employees go, I had no idea I was getting these comments, or I didn't know this is how my manager felt. That effectively is an indictment of your process. It's not saying the manager did anything wrong, but what it's saying is there's not timeliness, that the employee is going into the appraisal with an assumption of this is how I'm valued, this is what my manager thinks of me, and then hearing a different message. Jasmine, anything you would add to that?
So when it comes to growth mindset, and this is a phrase from Carol Dweck's groundbreaking research on the growth mindset, people who have the growth mindset and that carries on to organizations, they're looking at continual improvements as opposed to having the feeling, oh, I have arrived, or there is no improvement that can be done to this. Kind of a parallel to that is the Japanese concept of Kaizen, which again focuses culturally. It's a philosophy of being, of driving continuous improvements all the time. Toyota Corporation famously incorporated it into driving improvements to their production lines, and they produced a lot of dependability as a result of that. So that's, again, a cultural change for an organization. It doesn't happen overnight, but the way culture changes, we're all representatives of the culture. So if we as individual managers behave a certain way and start using those concepts ourselves, it will spread. Otherwise, change does not come in. And frankly, in a growth mindset situation, you do not sit and wait for HR to then put together a new policy and feed it up down. It's you can help raise the awareness of your HR department to start looking at this to drive the change that way. So this is also about empowerment in driving that change in terms of performance assessments. Timeliness, I think I personally feel that aside from all the research, there is a sense that everything is accelerated. The way things, the new technologies we use, the texting, the immediate feedback, millennials and Gen Z coming into the workforce and them needing this immediate feedback. They have grown up in a different reality. So it's really important to maximize the effectiveness of the organization in having feedback mechanisms that actually are correlated to the needs of your audience. Because they want to hear the feedback. It is absolutely essential. So we just cannot ignore that. And generally, absolutely every single person likes hearing the feedback from the positive perspective. Not just go rah, 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 praising everything, but try to evaluate what's working, what's not working, and how can we improve. And if it's a joint journey, it's a different proposition. So providing modern day performance feedback is not about having those historically antagonistic conversations that take in corporate offices across America once a year, but actually having a dialogue and a partnership that's focused on delivering results and driving improvements. That's a common goal. Joe?
So now let's talk about what you want to do in terms of specific options. And we want to talk about the concept of check-ins. And very good. So let me explain a little bit about what a check-in is and how it operates, and then Jasmine will have a couple of additional comments and background for you about this. Increasingly, we're seeing a large number of organizations who are doing away with ratings, they're doing away with annual reviews, and they're going to the most common names at check-ins. Some refer to them as syncs, some refer to them as conversations. But generally speaking, the way most of these operate is that a manager meets with the employee, will give you what a template for what a check-in might look like. But they're not evaluating the employee on a 1 to 5 scale or a 1 to 7 or 1 to 10 Likert scale, anything like that. Instead, they're usually having a couple of different topics they want to focus on. Most of the organizations that have moved to check-ins specify these need to happen twice a year. And that's an implementation. And then from there, they usually move to 4 times a year. And then ultimately, for the organizations that have really embraced them culturally, what happens is they don't specify how many times a year it needs to happen. Instead, it's as needed, which means if someone's got a project that's very volatile and changing a great deal, and so you need to check in with them a lot, then your check-ins are happening maybe every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. Rogers Communication, for their call center, what's interesting is they actually require managers to have a 30-minute check-in with every employee on their team every week. So the organizations that I've spoken to who do check-ins, the ones who've moved past 1 or 2 years, and so this is starting to become part of their culture now, what they say is they don't require a certain number of times a year, but rather it's as needed. And what that means is it's happening very frequently, and it's driven by the nature of the employee. So a veteran employee who knows the task, who's done it before, probably requires fewer check-ins. A new employee or someone who is new to that particular task, or let's say it's a very complex task, may require more frequent check-ins. And those check-ins really are talking about a combination of things that we'll talk about in the next slide, but they're really focusing on performance and assessing how are people doing and what support do they need and what do they need to improve. Jasmine, what would you add to that?
So you're seeing some very prominent logos of organizations that are actually not just about any organizations, they're usually trendsetters and they're bellwether organizations. So Deloitte was the first one in the U.S. that actually said, you know what, we're giving up on our traditional performance reviews. it's not working. They conducted a voluminous internal research. They did an organizational survey. They interviewed people, and they boldly led the way in stepping away from it. Now, having said that, there are reports that there are at times old-fashioned managers that are so entrenched in the way they used to conduct performance reviews that they do the so-called shadow performance reviews, though they're trying to follow up with the check-ins and having more frequent conversations. But the list is remarkable. Again, these are bellwether organizations that have huge workforces. GE has 300,000 employees. IBM has 380,000 employees. Accenture has 449,000 employees. And they're also global organizations. So what they do has repercussions far broader than the bounds of our own country. And these organizations are seeing the need for the change. GE is particularly remarkable because Jack Welch kind of led with the command and control process of stack ranking. It was like religion for them, and IBM had copied the same approach. But what it did is it stifled innovation. And here's a quote from an IBM employee that said, who was a long-time IBM employee, who says, "In the groups where I work, there were explicit efforts stated by management to reduce the need for and presence of quote-unquote heroes. The idea is that quote-unquote value within the company is not within its people, but rather within process definitions and intellectual capital. People were intended to be nothing more than replaceable parts, resources that can be changed out and swapped at will." And now the marketplace is changing. With the advent of technology, people are more mobile. The Labor Department projects that the average millennial will be in a position for 18 months, which with this give extreme mobility, there is a real war on talent because we need to keep and retain our well-performing employees. So to not treat them with the respect, to not mind the innovation that all these people can deliver is actually counterproductive for any organization. So to see that the Accentures of the world are taking notice of this and driving the change is a huge hopeful sign for the marketplace. Joe?
Okay, so let's talk about what a check-in actually looks like. And it's going to vary a little bit from company to company. But the research that I've seen in the organizations I've worked with, most check-ins operate on a pretty similar template or model. And the way to think of this is that, remember, you're not doing this once or even twice a year, but ideally what it ultimately evolves to is you're doing this as the work changes, or the employee has particular challenges or needs or questions. So the first piece is we talk about expectations. When we talk about expectations, this means everything from, so what's the work assignment? What kind of results are we supposed to produce here? How are we going to measure success? How am I going to measure your performance? And this isn't the manager dictating this to the employee. It's the manager and the employee actually having a conversation about this. What's the timeline? What resources do you think we need for this project? What resources are available? So those are all things you'd cover in the expectations section. In the feedback section, there's a great phrase that I think comes out of Marshall Goldsmith that NASA likes to use, where they say, don't talk about feedback, talk about feed forward. So if I'm a manager and I'm speaking to a particular performer, it's always a tougher conversation if we talk about what that performer did and why I didn't like it or what was wrong about it. It's generally speaking going to be a much more productive conversation, one that allows us to move forward if instead we have a conversation where I'm saying, I know how we did it in the past. Here's how I'd like us to handle this project in the future. Or here's how I'd like us to handle this proposal from this point on. Or here's how I'd like reporting on this project to be for the next 2 months. So the feedback is really a feed forward. How do we want things to be different? It's not dumping on someone. It's talking about, okay, so how do we change the performance? The other thing that's important to keep in mind about the feedback piece is it's reciprocal. This means it's a conversation, and the employee, the performer, can say to the manager, you know what? Originally you'd said we should check in like once a month. I don't think that's enough. I don't think that's realistic. Or, geez, you're asking me to check in once a month. I got this. You need to have more confidence in me. I think we can do this once every 2 months. I'll reach out if I need help, but I'm in good shape. The growth and development then, and this is an important piece not to ignore, the growth and development is a conversation with the manager and the performer about, so what are you getting better at? What are areas you want to improve at? What are some areas in terms of growth? Let's look ahead 6 months, a year, year and a half. What are the big steps that you need to take? The other thing that I'll say about these check-ins, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too when we talk about what's necessary for them to be successful, is that maybe initially what will happen is you'll say you need to schedule 2 times a year or 4 times a year. And then once it becomes embedded in the culture, then people do it on a much more frequent basis. Part of the pushback you'll sometimes get from managers is, this is just one more thing for me to do. And the message that managers need to get is, this is not one more thing to do. This is how you manage in your company. Instead of a command and control structure, now we have workforces with a lot more skill, a lot more competence, much more expectation of independence, but also, or autonomy, but also much more requirement that we collaborate and we not operate in silos. And so that requires that collaboration, and that requires that sort of conversation. And that means, therefore, that the manager not only needs to adapt and do this as often as necessary, but the employee needs to reach out to make sure that these happen. The manager certainly has some accountability for this, but ultimately, if check-ins don't occur, HR is not going to jump on top of the manager. Instead, what they should be doing is contacting the performer to say, okay, why didn't you get these scheduled? Why didn't you get these on the calendar? Because it's not a performance appraisal. Instead, it's a check-in about how are we doing on performance. And the person doing the work, the performer, is accountable for making sure that the manager is in the loop on this, okay? So that's basically how this 3-step check-in model works. Jasmine, anything you would add to this?
Yes, to me, this is just pure common sense, but then we all know that common sense is not always very common. It's really impossible to manage effectively, but by not feeling the pulse of how your employees, your team is doing. And this in no way means micromanaging. It just means being present. It means having like an environment where people can actually ask questions, bring new ideas, and share. It means an environment that promotes innovation. So to expect that, oh, so-and-so is working on this project and we'll find out at the end of the year how they did it, that's a disservice to absolutely everyone, to the manager, to the employee, and to the organization at large. Because if there are things to be done, it's absolutely phenomenally better. There's a recent HBR article on curiosity, which uses the example of Pixar Studios, where they constantly, I mean, they're working with creative, beautiful cartoons that have more wisdom than most people will credit. And when somebody brings a creative idea, they don't shoot it down immediately. They'll say, well, okay, this and plus, how about we try this as well? Because it's about fostering the creativity rather than undercutting. Because working from fear has never promoted any creativity in any organization. It only stifles creativity. So it's about creating a safety space also for people to fail and fail fast. The reason why Silicon Valley has been driving innovation so successfully is because they have a subculture that actually rewards people for failing, but failing fast. That's really important because without testing things, it's impossible to drive innovation. Johnson & Johnson Corporation every year launches at least 180 new products, knowing full well that only 5 of those will be successful in the market. But that's like innovation on steroids and failing on steroids because they fully realize for us to find the 5 that work, we really need to innovate. So the current performance review model is set up to stifle innovation. So driving check-ins is important in that people should have conversations that is looking broader than just a single employee's performance, but rather how is our organization culturally handling innovation. So there is more to this than just like a one-on-one review.
Okay,
No?
so let's talk about what the process looks like. If you decide that you want to go with check-ins, how would you implement them? And there are a couple of different elements that need to be part of any process. You see, the first bullet says role models. Let me be real explicit about what this means. Senior leadership needs to not just be on board, they need to set an example. That could be everything from you'd use a fishbowl technique at a town hall meeting where someone would sit down with the senior manager and they would go through a check-in. It could mean a senior manager standing or senior leader standing up in the town hall meeting and sharing with employees, okay, here's something I need to get better at, or here's a mistake that I made. It cost us some money. In fact, we're not going to get a bonus this year because of this mistake. I mean, people wouldn't be happy to hear that, but the point is, it's senior leaders standing up saying, here's an area I need to get better at, or here's a mistake, or here's an area to grow. This whole idea of a growth mindset, it's not enough for senior management to stand up and say, okay, folks, grow, grow. Instead, you've got to cultivate a culture and you've got to reward people who are willing to say, I'm weak in this area, or I need to get better in this skill. The other element that I think is important for role models is the very first check-in that a manager has when they sit down with the performer. I would suggest that the manager start out by asking to the performer, how can I be better as a manager? What would you like to see me do better at? What do you think I failed to support you well enough at as a manager? In part because what's happening is it's easy to say, okay, let's have a growth mindset. Let's talk about how we can improve. You first, okay? Instead, you've got to engage in trust building measures. Second piece about manager skills, let's be brutally honest here. Some managers don't have the skills or the inclination to use or to utilize check-ins effectively. They come from a command and school mindset, and they're not going to be able to adapt. Just like if you have an organization that went to a team-based model or went to matrix organizations, you've got some managers who couldn't adjust to that. You will have some managers who cannot handle check-ins. Or the point I made earlier, their response will be, I don't have time for these. When am I going to fit it in? And your response to that needs to be, this isn't about fitting it in. This is not about an additional thing you're supposed to do. This is how you're expected to manage. If you can't manage by having conversations with people, not something you're going to call a conversation, but it's you dictating stuff to an employee. Instead, if you can't manage by having a conversation about, so how's it going? What support do you need? How are we going to measure that performance? We're asking more questions than you are giving orders or saying things. If you can't manage that way, then you can't manage in this organization. So for some people and some cultures, that's a sea change. The third piece is around meetings, and that is the whole concept of check-ins doesn't work unless you actually have the meetings. There will be some organizations and some managers who, when they hear that you're doing away with ratings and replacing them with check-ins, will go, oh, good, we've done away with performance appraisals. You're still going to do performance management, but you've changed the way that you do it and the way you measure it. The accountability, I talked about this a little bit earlier. Everyone needs to be accountable, but the first person who's accountable is the performer, the employee. It's not an acceptable excuse for the employee to say, well, my manager never scheduled a meeting. The performer needs to be bugging the manager, and if the manager won't put them on the calendar or keeps canceling meetings, then they need to go to HR and go, hey, I keep trying to set up a check-in with my manager. I need to get some feedback on something. I want to give them some information, and it's not happening. The last two bullets I want to talk about, purpose. The purpose is not to have a check-in. The purpose is to improve performance. So if you think back to the factors we talked about in terms of improving performance, like being objective rather than subjective, or creating a growth mindset, or providing feedback in a timely fashion, it's not enough to check the box and go, there, we did a check-in. No, you need to instead set the stage, create the culture, create the atmosphere so your conversations with an employee promote a growth mindset. If you're not doing that, then you're not doing a check-in. If it's not timely, you're not doing a check-in. If it's not objective, you're not doing a check-in. So all of those pieces are important. The last piece around thoughtful transitions, there are plenty of organizations that have had great success stories. Adobe's an excellent example. They've got a lot of stuff on their website in terms of free resources where they talk about their check-in system and how they approach it and what they've learned and how they went about it. What is generally true is that this is not a case where you're going to announce you're going to do it. You hold a town hall meeting and go, okay, folks, we're blowing up the appraisal process. No more annual appraisal. That'll get cheers. And then you go, instead, we're going to go to check-ins. And everyone will eye each other nervously. Instead, you've got to plan what the transition is. And you've got to recognize that it will be a transition. You may start out with 2 check-ins a year and then go to 4. And then at some point, it starts to multiply, just like rabbits. Jasmine, anything you would add to this?
Well, it's again learning about the practice, implementing, and actually following through. Right? All the best strategies are only as good as their execution. And so both the managers and the employees have to have the vision and follow through with the check-in. You're absolutely correct that employees should show initiative and request that their manager respond. I think we're looking at an even more broken situation if somebody has to go to HR for that. But there are other issues going in that relationship and situation, and then the manager is really missing the boat on what they should be doing. Interestingly, managing people in terms of compensation is one of the highly weighted factors that determine how a person is paid. Yet at the same time, a lot of managers, again, will buy initiatives. For 10 years, they usually will not get training on how to provide a performance appraisal reviews. Those do not occur. So those are issues for people to look at and also to take initiative. And frankly, managers should themselves be authentic and not be afraid to say, hey, what can I do better? How can we improve this? Can we sit on our world, or shall we be looking at some different approaches? Because the moment we stop looking for other approaches is the moment where we stop innovating and experimenting. That's really important for the entire organization. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about another element besides check-ins that can improve your performance management. And this is something you can do to coincide with check-ins, or you can do it separately. So if you have a management team that for one reason or another is not willing to walk away from ratings, or check-ins sounds a little bit too scary for them, this is something that you can do independently of check-ins or in conjunction with. The piece that I want to talk about specifically is to focus on accomplishments rather than competencies. And let me explain something. Accomplishment is something that is of value to the organization. And oftentimes what ends up happening is we end up assessing people on the basis of their competencies or their skills without looking at what's the payoff or what's the benefit to the organization from that particular skill. And then we want to measure what the benefit is. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate this. For just about every team leader or manager out there, one of the things we're going to want them to do is to be a good communicator. And so oftentimes an assessment for a manager will look at communication skills. I would argue that has almost no value to a business. Plus, it's also very subjective. If we were to ask the question, why do we care about communication skills for managers? We would give answers like, well, if a manager is a good communicator, then their team will know what's going on, they'll know what the priorities are, they'll know what their role is, they know what the expectations are. So that's what we should assess then. And if I were to measure Jasmine, rather than evaluate her on her communication skills, I would go to her team and I would say, do each of you know what your priorities are? Do each of you know what your role is? Do each of you know where you stand performance-wise? And if their answers to all those questions are yes, 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 then that means effectively Jasmine's a good communicator because she's accomplishing what good communication is supposed to accomplish. Let me give you one other example to illustrate this. Is there was a particular manager that an organization I'd done some work with, and there was one particular manager that was being dinged on their performance appraisal. And when I asked why, I was told poor time management. So I said, what's the time management issue? And in this particular case, the time management issue was a certain report needed to be done by the close of business on Friday, and instead it was being turned in by Monday or Tuesday. So if we look at, so why is that report being turned in late? It turned out that that manager couldn't complete that report until another department out in the field had submitted their expenses and their travel information. And because they were submitting it late, and in some cases it wasn't getting in until Monday, the manager couldn't submit it till Tuesday. So instead of dinging that manager or criticizing them for poor time management, you want to assess, okay, instead of time management, let's look at, are they getting this report done accurately and in a timely fashion? And if the answer is no, then you can have a conversation with that. And the manager can say, well, how can I get this done by Friday when I don't get the data till Monday, till after the week's over? And then we can have a much more accurate conversation. Now, some of you, let me anticipate just a little bit. Some of you will say, but Joe, what happens if you've got an employee who's a good performer, but they have bad behavior? You know, we've all seen examples of someone who hits the sales quota, but they're a jerk to other people in the organization. Or the researcher who comes up with brilliant ideas, but they show up late all the time. Or they treat other people badly. Or they blow off meetings. What I would argue is we should evaluate people on stuff that matters to the organization. So if what matters to the organization is how you treat your coworkers, then find a way to assess that. And then it shouldn't be possible to say this person's a great performer, but they're a jerk with their coworkers. If we care about them, whether or not they're a jerk to coworkers or whether they treat coworkers well, in other words, the old phrase, they play well with others, then let's measure that, because that's an accomplishment. Playing well with others matters. If, on the other hand, you're not willing to fire people or demote people on that basis, you're saying that's not an accomplishment for us. So the whole concept of accomplishments is not saying the ends justify the means. It's saying let's identify what matters most to the organization. Let's identify the stuff that we care about. And if people achieve them, then we're happy. And if people don't achieve them, then we're unhappy, as opposed to, oh, it's just something we prefer, but it doesn't really matter. Jasmine, is there anything you'd like to say about the other bullets on this slide?
Sure. The issue-based, not person-based. This approach would actually serve everyone much better if we conducted our difficult conversations based on issues. Separating that from the people and the personalities and kind of being explicit about that, and also leading with answers rather than definitive statements, because there's always the possibility we're missing some context, we don't have some information. So asking first makes a difference, and being clear that you're not a horrible person. This is not about you being, by the way, this is advice that would also benefit every single couple out there in the universe. So driving with an issue rather than, oh, this is all about you and you always do that, it is a huge phenomenon. By the way, the social psychology supports this. A lot of the time when we're giving explanations about ourselves, if we're late, we'll say, oh, I don't know, the T in Boston, which is our subway, was delayed or there was traffic. But very often if we're talking about a team member or somebody else, we will forget those factors and say, oh, Jamie is always late. This is a fictional Jamie, by the way. So we immediately then personalize the person. So this leads to a form of labeling that we all engage in, pigeonholing people, and then it's reflected in our conversations that we have with people. And that's a very dangerous place to be. In social psychology, there's also the concept of polarization, which is if people holding diametrically different opinions come to talk with each other, no matter how much they talk, chances are that they're going to be leaving even more entrenched in their own position than they started out with. Unfortunately, this is the landscape that we have today in our performance management processes. And so they, in effect, are so ineffective, which again validates the 98% poll that we had up front. So how do we change this? Again, by having conversations that are question-driven, asking why, one of the most underused words in the English language. Why is this happening? How can we improve? Asking questions rather than telling will allow us to come to a common denominator way more quickly and efficiently than just, talking at people and personalizing. So that's a really important distinction. Being authentic. Nobody is right 100%. And just even talking about our own fears, concerns, personalizing people. That's really important. If you're a manager and you do not, not to pry into people's personal lives, but to view them as a whole, holistic human being, knowing what it is that, really tickles their fancy. What is it that really energizes them? And working from strengths, that's also another huge thing to have to bring into the equation to make those conversations really meaningful. that's a world, game changer. Joe?
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. I think actually we want to just a couple things to say in terms of driving change here. And pretty straightforward. What it says, clear performance management goals. Another way to put that is you want to be clear about what you're attempting to do with your performance management system. And I think the cop-out answer most people would say is, duh, manage performance. No, you need to identify, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to do a better job identifying high potential talent or people that are worthy of promotion? Are we trying to improve people's actual performance? And then use those to help drive what your system looks like. The other piece in terms of time and effort, there are going to be a lot of legacy assumptions. So you can explain the concept of check-ins or trying to come up with more objective measures, such as using accomplishments, and people may agree with it in theory, but they will have difficulty giving up a process which is very archaic and not particularly effective. But the end result is you end up with better performance management, better performance assessments. So that's what's at stake here. Jasmine, anything else you would add?
Well, this is not a one and done situation, right? It's really important for people to get started on this journey. It won't happen overnight, but it's about having meaningful conversations. It's about being transparent and actually, putting your focus where you believe it's worth doing. So continuing with the old-fashioned performance management systems kind of speaks about where your organizational goals are and that you're going through the motion without really putting laser focus and value on that. As George Lucas says, you are what you focus on. So this is more about driving organizational change and organizational culture and making sure that those conversations are happening. And also, last but not least, it's about educating, doing leadership training, management training, making sure you're educating your managers to be effective in the conversations they're having with their teams, be it in goal setting or in assessments, because those are key to the organizational success, and it will not happen on its own. So that's really important. Joe, if you have nothing to add, we can open up to questions.
Yeah.
All right. Joe and Jasmine, thank you. If you have a question for Joe or Jasmine, click on the Q&A icon, type in your question, click submit. With that, we have a lot of questions in here, probably more than we're going to be able to get to with the time remaining. But we're going to start with one I'm going to send to you, Joe, first. This one comes from Olga. Olga's question is, beyond the intrinsic benefits of growth for an employee, how do you incentivize staff with this check-in model?
Great question, Olga. I think the short answer is that, first of all, I think there are a lot of ways you can incentivize employees. First of all, the check-in model itself, the check-in approach itself, is a much better kind of relationship to have with your manager. All of you can think back to performance appraisals or review processes that you've had that you lost sleep over, or you went in thinking like you needed to justify who you were, as opposed to having a conversation about how's the job going, how do we get better. So the first thing is the process itself is a good way to incentivize. But Olga, I suspect you are also asking about how do you determine who gets the bonuses? And first of all, you're still able to do that using a check-in system, because effectively what you're doing is you're not just saying, okay, Olga, I have an assignment for you. What questions do you have about it? What resources do you need? Okay, get back to me in a month. Instead, what happens is we're talking about how's your performance going and how should we measure that performance? How should we track it? And so we're reaching agreement about how to measure that. And then as we go along, we're not waiting till the end of the year. We're having conversations about that. The organizations that utilize check-ins have actually discovered that for the most part, it's not a problem trying to identify who gets benefits and who doesn't. The other thing that I will say that I've seen with some organizations that have gone with check-ins is they've also gone to some different models in terms of how you reward performance. So what happens is it's more likely to be seen across the organization, and then they'll have specific awards in case someone does something particularly extraordinary, like they bring in that $10 million contract or they rush into a burning building and save someone. And so you acknowledge them for stuff that's just way above and beyond the call of duty. So in terms of rewarding performance, a lot of different ways to get there.
All right, perfect. We're going to move on to a next one here from Chandra. We'll start with Jasmine on this one, and then Joe, if you have anything to add, please feel free. Chandra's question is, every manager has a different idea of what a 5 is. How do you, if you are stuck with the appraisal numbers, how do you remove the variance so that a 5 looks the same regardless of who the manager is and or the department a person works in?
Well, thank you, Chandra, for the question. It's a very good question. It's okay to live with the variance, actually. Just try to understand what the 5 means to that particular manager. Because, again, it's really important for the organizations to work from people's strengths. I don't know if some of you have done the Clifton Strength Finder, so I would start with that. So people are getting assignments that are going to play to their strengths rather than not. And then, it's understanding what is it that this particular manager sees as a value. I mean, I've come across professors at universities who do not believe that anybody deserves an A. So you're kind of describing the same scenario. Having said that, you can find a core even to that kind of a professor to understand why not and how to make this work, rather than looking for a one-size-fits-all approach, because that will not really happen. Even our U.S. legal system, most people may dislike it, but prosecutors have significant authority to, adjust the legal. The average person is not thinking of that in those terms, but it's the law is not like completely similarly applied given the circumstances. So it's really important to understand what that manager's scale looks like. And again, engage in a conversation, ask, have them make a case for it, and then try to meet those requirements.
Yeah, well, let me add my 2 cents on this. So, Chandra, you've just made a great case for why one should abolish or do away with ratings and go to check-ins. Because ratings, even though they're numerical and in theory are objective, are so subjective. So the first point is, I think that if that's a problem for organizations, you want to look pretty seriously at ratings, at doing away with ratings and going with check-ins. The second point is, with check-ins, it's not essential that we all evaluate every person the same way. What's essential is that I, as the performer, and if Jasmine's my manager, that she and I share expectations. If she's making it very clear that the top performance for this particular task is at a very high level, I may think that's unrealistic, but at least I know what's expected of me. When you're trying to do ratings across the entire organization, you're trying to force everyone to be uniform. And a check-in system doesn't require that level of uniformity. It simply requires a meeting of the mind between the performer and the employee. The second point that I'm going to say is, if you focus more on accomplishments and less on competencies, you're able to be much more focused on objective ways of measuring performance, and that way you can be consistent.
All right. So that's going to be actually all the time we have for questions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of them. There were a ton of them that did roll through, but we do have those all on record, and we will take a look at those here going forward. So Joe and Jasmine, I want to thank you both for taking the time to be here with us today. I want to thank the Training Associates for sponsoring this webinar today. It's been a pleasure working with them over the past month or so, getting this event on the Chief Learning Officer network here. So it's been a pleasure, as I said, and thank you to everybody in the audience for your participation. Like I said, we had a ton of questions come in, and unfortunately we weren't able to get to them all. If you enjoyed the presentation, please take the time to fill out a quick post-event survey, which is going to appear right as this webinar ends. Your feedback is very important to us, and it does help us improve our events moving forward. So thanks again to everybody on the line. We'll see you all back here for our next CLO webinar, which will take place this coming Thursday, September 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, and it's titled Talent Spotting and Succession Planning, Filling Your Leadership Pipeline. Also, if you enjoy Chief Learning Officer's content and any of the content you heard today, please make sure to sign up for our new podcast by visiting clobreakfastclub.com. There you'll find a link to subscribe to that podcast. So thanks again to everybody on the line. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.